Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Madison, and if this is the first time that you're tuning in to this channel, teaching, reading, dreaming, I am so glad you're here. And today is going to be all about my June wrap-up. All of the books that I read in June, I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share my thoughts about them and whether or not I think they would be good for student reading and so on. So let's hop into it. The first book I read in June was actually not a book at all. It was a play. I read Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. And the reason I chose this book is because I really enjoy the movie and stage adaptation of My Fair Lady. And if you're unfamiliar with that, it is based on Pygmalion. And I had seen My Fair Lady and lots of other movies that referenced My Fair Lady, and I figured it was time for me to actually read the source material for all of those good things. I did not give this play 5 stars because I think I enjoy My Fair Lady better than the original, and because of that I deducted a star. But what was interesting about this book personally is that I was taking a linguistics class at the same time I was reading this play. And this play is about a linguist who makes a bet with a friend that he can turn any girl into a duchess, or at least make a room full of high society people believe she is a duchess. So he chooses a flower girl, a flower seller on the street named Eliza, who is full of fire and spunk, and she really brings so much life into the pages, and it is not hard to understand why Pygmalion and My Fair Lady have become such successes, because George Bernard Shaw creates just a firecracker character with Eliza who is charming. And Henry Higgins is not charming, but he is in his own way. So he's a lovable, unlovable fellow, and they are perfect in those roles, playing off of each other. Because I had read Pygmalion, I was in the mood to read something else that kind of had to do with theater and musical theater, and so I chose to pick up Drama, which is a graphic novel that I have seen so many of my own students reading in my classroom. I had it in my classroom, but I had not yet read it, and I am so glad I did. It was the first full book that I read while I took a vacation to the beach with my family, and it was the perfect beach read. I read this in 1 or 2 sittings, definitely in one day, and for any teachers who are watching, Drama is definitely a book that you will likely enjoy, and you'll enjoy it very quickly because it's easy to read. And the thing that I loved most about Drama is, with all of the High School Musical-esque works of like TV and literature, the author really takes that story of school plays and spring musicals, but puts the spotlight on the technical crew backstage, which was so interesting. And I loved how the action featured the backstage crew instead of those on stage. And I thought that the illustrations, the graphics really brought the story to life because it was very theatrical. The illustrations added to that and added a lot of interesting sort of nods to popular musical theater, and I personally did musical theater in high school, and that was awesome for me. So my theater nerd heart absolutely loved reading Drama, and I ended up giving this book 3 stars, but I think it is perfect for middle school students. They would most definitely enjoy it. I also read Brown Girl Dreaming on the beach, and it was so great. It was the book that I am probably most glad that I read in June. It follows the story of the author, Jacqueline Woodson, and she tells of her story moving as a small child from Ohio into the South, and all of the racial tensions that she moved into with her family. And she tells the story in poetry, which I think is, if the story wasn't already good enough, the fact that she tells the story in poems just makes it the perfect addition to any classroom. Not only do students get experience reading memoir, they also get a really raw personal perspective on racial issues in the American South and in the North as well. And I think that was just, it was beautiful the way that she wrote about very raw things, but she does it in poetry, which many students are afraid of, especially in middle school. And it was so accessible. The language that she uses is very accessible. It would be easy for a middle school student to understand, and they would fall in love just like I did, and it was so amazing. A thing that I loved about the story specifically, and that I loved when I read Stella by Starlight in May, was that Jacqueline Woodson provides the picture of a young artist, a young writer who is learning how to express herself, and she fails sometimes, but it just tells the story of perseverance, especially when a young person is developing talent. And I think that's a message that a lot of students need to hear, and Jacqueline Woodson does it beautifully. I gave this book 4 stars, but it was really a lot more like 4.5 stars. I enjoyed this book thoroughly. The next work of fiction I read on the beach was The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry. And this is a book that surprised me from the second chapter. I read the book thinking that the protagonist would not be who it ended up being, and so it caught me off guard, and I love that about a book, and it just kept me interested and engaged the entire way through. The novel follows the story of A.J. Fikry, who owns a little bookshop, and it was a bookshop that he purchased with his wife in her hometown, but she died, leaving him the bookstore that he will not sell. And it tells the story of his transition from a bitter guy into someone who learns to love again. And it tells that story primarily through his relationship with his daughter, who is dropped off as a baby in his bookstore. And while that premise sounds really cheesy and like a Disney movie a little bit, it really works. It works perfectly, and I really enjoyed it. Another thing that I loved about that book is the beginning of each chapter begins with a little almost review type snippet in the writing of A.J. Fikry, talking about a different short story. So he references Flannery O'Connor and other authors that I absolutely love. So while I was reading a story, I already enjoyed seeing those little review sort of snippets that A.J. Fikry himself has written. Was great, and I loved it. I ended up giving this book 4 stars as well. A children's book I read while at the beach was an ARC provided to me by NetGalley called When Life Gives You Mangoes. And this is a book that I will definitely be on the lookout for when it is released. And it is about a girl named Clara who lives in Jamaica. And the whole story centers around an unexplained event. And I think that is such a clever approach for the author Kereen Getten to take, because not many students would be familiar with a plot that focuses on an event that is completely unexplained. Clara, for an unidentified reason, struggles with memory loss, and for part of the book you believe that it could be because of a hurricane or the likes of something like that. However, that is not revealed until the very end of the book. And it really centers around Clara's relationship with her best friend, and they have had a falling out. And throughout the novel, I kept thinking to myself how relevant that sort of conflict is for students, especially in upper elementary school and middle school, when they are dealing with just personal relationships and friendships that sometimes go awry. The book also focuses on the idea of an outcast of the community. Clara's uncle is seen as an outcast because some of the townspeople have told lies about him, which cause him to be excluded from their community. And Clara really has to come to terms with that and with her own parents' secrecy regarding that event. I think the fact that this book does delve into childhood trauma through the eyes of a child is really significant because students deal with trauma, and I think the fact that it is present in this book is very unique. The book that was a little out of the ordinary for me to read was called The Lies That Bind by best-selling author Emily Giffin. And my mom has read lots of Emily Giffin's past books. I saw them while I was growing up. She is such a well-known name, and she also lives in Georgia, which is where I live. So I ended up basically having to read this book on vacation because I was there with my family, and my aunt read this book in a day or so, and she just couldn't put it down. And then after that, my mother read the book, and she read it in a day. And so this book was sitting on the coffee table, and this book to me was the quintessential beach read. It was a page turner, it had humor, it was heartfelt in a lot of places as well. It tells the story of, and I pause, Cecily. Those are the pronunciations that I have found everywhere online. No one agrees on the correct pronunciation of that name because so many people say this name differently. So, with that being said, I said this name in my head all 3 different ways throughout the entire book. So, however you pronounce that name, that is the name of the main character. So, Cecily is the main character of this book, and Giffin tells the story of this woman, Cecily, whose life is completely just turned around in the wake of 9/11. I thought that Giffin did a wonderful job of reconstructing the everyday life of a woman living in Manhattan in 2001. And what's interesting to me about that is really stories about 9/11 fit into the historical fiction genre, which is crazy to think about because most of us were alive and remember that event very vividly. But the way that she talks about the culture of that time was really interesting to me because I was very young when that happened. The story, like many of Giffin's novels, centers around kind of a love triangle sort of situation, and I normally don't have very much patience for books with love triangles. This one, I did feel the same way. A lot of the parts, especially having to do with romance, seemed very tedious to me. But if you're looking for a page turner, even if it is predictable in parts, I would recommend The Lies That Bind, and I ended up giving this book 3 stars. My last fiction book that I read in June was called Wolf Hollow. And this is another book that has been sitting in my classroom, and I hadn't gotten around to reading it until summer. So I'll go ahead and say that I gave this book 4 stars. And the reason that I didn't give it 5 stars, even though in parts I really wanted to, was because it was very difficult for me to get through this book. I started Wolf Hollow in mid-June and didn't finish it until the very last couple of days of June, which is very out of the ordinary for me when I read YA or children's lit. Normally those books are so interesting and just engaging that they're very easy to get through. However, that was not the case for me with Wolf Hollow. But I'm very glad that I stuck to it and finished it. The story follows Annabelle, who is growing up in post-World War II United States. And though the book starts out with her dealing with a bully who comes to school, which to me was very reminiscent of stories from Little House on the Prairie and episodes from the TV show where Laura and Nellie Olson hate each other and are completely at odds throughout most of the series. But though it starts out like that, and I think that was part of the reason that I couldn't get through it very quickly, it ends up being such a touching story of a family's dedication to justice. However, the story really starts to pick up when the bully goes missing, and Annabelle and her family have to join together to prove that a man named Toby, who is a war veteran suffering from PTSD, they have to prove that Toby is not the one to blame. I think this story is fantastic for older elementary school, middle school students because it really does prove that not all endings are happy because of prejudice and just hatred in the world. And I think that seeing this story through Annabelle's eyes really would make a student, because it made me think about the way we judge people and whether or not they are treated justly. So I will quickly reference the two books that I read not quite every page of, but most of during June while I was working on some coursework for my degree program that I'm in, a Master's of English. I read most of Research Methods, some really great reading material here, but actually, in all honesty, Nicholas Walliman does a really good job of trying to make Research Methods interesting. All of the chapters were very succinct, which I appreciated. I didn't feel like there was anything that was too boring, and it wasn't a bad read at all. I didn't dread reading it when I got new assignments. So if you want to know more about research methods in English studies, then this would be the book for you. For a research project I did a lot of work within the Differentiated Classroom by Carol Tomlinson. And if you are an educator, you probably have read a lot of Tomlinson's work and her research about differentiation in the classroom. Much of what I use in my own classroom is based on her ideas. And the Differentiated Classroom really, to me, is a staple of professional development and has a place in my personal classroom. So I enjoyed that as well. And the cover is very pretty and cute and adds some life. So I did not read this book for my school work, but I did read this book to benefit me at my school, in my classroom. So I had a goal in June to read books that I thought would be beneficial to my students and to me as a teacher, and this book was my 5-star read that did that. The Book Whisperer by Donalyn Miller is going to be a book that I read every summer. Maybe not every page of it every summer, but it will be an every summer read for me because it was that transformational to my thinking, especially after digital learning, which may continue. The teachers in the United States and elsewhere, we're really in an uncertain time, and it's hard to kind of get the energy and excitement back up for the upcoming school year, at least for me. But the Book Whisperer really did serve to just remind me of why I wanted to teach ELA and reading specifically, and she gives so many great practical tips about teaching reading and helping model a love of reading in the classroom. And that is something, my primary goal actually for the upcoming year, is to be a model for the love of reading. And so I would recommend this book to all reading teachers, all ELA teachers, and even if you're not a reading teacher, then pick it up and read some parts of it. It is free on Scribd as well, so if you have a Scribd membership, then just go through it and see what she says, because she gives tips that would be applicable to any discipline, really. Thank you so much for tuning in to this June recap. I read so many books that brought me joy, and I hope that some of them could pique an interest. And I will see you very soon with more reviews and teacher tips. And I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye-bye.